She walked into the luxury hotel, poised and elegant, but the waiter sneered and refused to serve her. Minutes later, his arrogance shattered when her son walked in and revealed a truth that left the entire room speechless. The crystal chandeliers sparkled above the grand dining hall of Le Chateau Royal, one of the most prestigious hotels in the city. The scent of aged wine and truffle risotto lingered in the air, mingling with the soft hum of classical music from a live quartet. Every table was adorned with pristine white tablecloths, fine china, and polished silverware, a clear indication that only the wealthiest and most influential dined here. Among the elegantly dressed patrons, a woman entered, poised, graceful, yet understated. She was older, perhaps in her late 60s, with deep brown skin that carried the wisdom of decades. Her hair, silver-streaked and neatly styled, framed her regal face. She wore a tailored cream-colored dress, modest but undeniably elegant, and a simple pearl necklace that gleamed under the chandelier light. Every movement she made was deliberate, effortless, as if she had walked these kinds of halls 1,000 times before. Yet, despite her undeniable presence, no one paid her any mind. To them, she was invisible. She approached an empty table by the large window, where the city skyline stretched in a breathtaking panorama. As she pulled out the chair and settled herself in, she did not look around, did not seek approval or acknowledgement. She simply waited. A young waiter, no older than 25, noticed her from across the room. James, the name embroidered on his crisp uniform, observed her with thinly veiled skepticism. His sharp blue eyes darted to her attire, her lack of obvious designer labels, the simple way she carried herself. A flicker of disdain crossed his face before he strode toward her table. When he arrived, his smile was polite, but his tone carried an unmistakable coldness. "Good evening, ma'am. I'm afraid we're fully booked tonight. Perhaps I can recommend a restaurant down the street." The woman's deep brown eyes lifted to meet his, calm and unwavering. There was no shock, no anger, just a quiet understanding that this was not the first time she had encountered such treatment. She exhaled softly, folding her hands in her lap. "Fully booked, you say?" James hesitated for the briefest second, sensing something unspoken in her tone, but quickly regained his composure. "That's correct. Unfortunately, we only accept guests with reservations." From behind the bar, an older waiter, Gregory, watched the exchange with a frown. Something about the woman unsettled him, though not in a bad way. She reminded him of someone important, but he couldn't quite place it. As James continued speaking, Gregory instinctively glanced at the guest list, then back at the woman. His brow furrowed. Something wasn't right. The woman, still calm, reached for the linen napkin at her table and slowly unfolded it. "That's unfortunate," she murmured, an almost imperceptible smile touching her lips. "I was looking forward to seeing how the service had changed over the years." James barely listened. He was already turning away, eager to dismiss her, but Gregory's voice suddenly cut through the air. "James." The younger waiter stopped. Gregory's expression was unreadable, his eyes flicking between the woman and the host's stand. He hesitated, then shook his head slightly, as if dismissing an absurd thought. "Are you sure about that?" James shot him a confused look. "Of course. We have high-profile clients tonight. This lady, she doesn't exactly fit the profile." A silence stretched between them. The woman remained still, quietly observing, while James felt a slight chill creep down his spine. Gregory's fingers tapped against the polished wood of the bar, a telltale sign that something was amiss. And then, ever so subtly, the woman did something strange. She reached into her small clutch and retrieved a single, delicately folded piece of paper. Placing it on the table, she slid it forward. An invitation, embossed with gold lettering, carrying the unmistakable emblem of Le Chateau Royal itself. For the first time, James hesitated. His fingers twitched at his side. Something about this woman, something about the way she carried herself, the way she responded to his dismissal with nothing but quiet patience, made him uneasy. He just didn't know why yet. But soon, he would. James hesitated for a moment, his fingers twitching at his side as he stared at the golden emblem on the invitation. His mind scrambled for an explanation. How did this woman get an invitation to one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city? His jaw tightened. "I'm afraid there must be some kind of mistake, ma'am," he said, his voice laced with impatience. He didn't even bother to touch the invitation. "This is a private dining event. Only distinguished guests are allowed." The woman simply blinked, her face an unreadable mask of patience. "And I don't seem distinguished to you?" she asked, her voice velvety smooth, but carrying a quiet power beneath the words. James stiffened at the question. A few diners had begun to take notice of the exchange, their murmurs barely audible over the sound of clinking silverware and soft classical music. He could feel their gazes pricking at the back of his neck, but he refused to back down. "It's just, we have a very strict guest policy," he continued, his tone condescending as he straightened his tie. Perhaps this invitation was meant for someone else. A sharp cough from behind the bar made James turn slightly. Gregory was still watching, his gaze now edged with something resembling concern. The older waiter had worked here for decades. He had seen guests of all kinds, but something about this woman unsettled him. Before James could speak again, the restaurant's manager, Mr. Whitmore, emerged from the back, his keen eyes scanning the room. He was an older man, tall and imposing in his tailored suit, exuding the type of confidence that came from years of running elite establishments. He strode over with a polished smile, but the moment his eyes landed on the elderly woman, his steps faltered. The change was subtle, but it was there. A brief flicker of recognition in his sharp gaze, a tension in his shoulders. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. James immediately straightened. "No problem at all, sir. This woman was just about to leave." "Was I?" The woman tilted her head ever so slightly, still calm, still unshaken. Whitmore's smile faltered as his eyes dropped to the golden invitation resting on the table. He picked it up delicately, as if afraid of what it would confirm. The moment he saw the name embossed in elegant cursive, his face drained of color. James noticed. "Sir?" he asked, confused. The manager swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the invitation, before carefully placing it back on the table. "Madam," he said, clearing his throat, I sincerely apologize for this misunderstanding." James blinked. "Sir, surely there's been some mistake. I mean, look at—" Whitmore shot him a sharp look, cutting him off immediately. "Be quiet." The sudden shift in tone stunned the young waiter. The once confident and dismissive air around him seemed to evaporate as he looked between Whitmore and the woman, a growing sense of unease bubbling in his chest. The woman, still composed, lifted her glass of water, taking a small sip before setting it down gently. "You know who I am," she said, her voice still carrying that quiet authority. Whitmore exhaled, nodding stiffly. "Yes, ma'am, and I deeply regret this unfortunate mishap." His hands trembled slightly as he gestured toward James. This boy doesn't know who he's speaking to. James's stomach twisted. "Who is she?" he asked, his voice coming out lower than he intended. Whitmore's lips pressed together in a thin line. He hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. You just insulted one of the most important women in this city's history. A hush fell over the nearby tables. James felt his heart drop, but he still couldn't understand. That doesn't make sense, he muttered. She's just what? The woman finally leaned forward, resting her hands on the table. There was no anger in her tone, only curiosity, as if daring him to complete his sentence. James couldn't find the words. He could feel something shifting, the power dynamic he had believed himself in control of slipping away like sand between his fingers. The weight of everyone's eyes on him felt suffocating. Gregory, who had been silent all this time, finally stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ma'am," he said, his voice shaking slightly. You're Dr. Evelyn Carter, aren't you?" The woman smiled for the first time that evening. James felt the ground beneath him vanish. Dr. Evelyn Carter. The name finally clicked, sending a cold shock through his veins. One of the most renowned civil rights attorneys of the last 50 years. A woman whose work had changed the landscape of equality and justice in the country. A woman who had dined in rooms far grander than this. And he had dismissed her, insulted her. The reality of the situation crashed down on him like a tidal wave. And the worst part? She hadn't even needed to raise her voice to break him. James felt his pulse hammer against his ribs as the weight of his mistake fully sank in. The name Dr. Evelyn Carter now echoed in his head, like a warning bell he had ignored for far too long. How had he not recognized her? He had seen that name before, on news articles, in textbooks, even in whispered conversations between his professors in university. The silence in the restaurant stretched unbearably. The once lively hum of conversation had faded, replaced by a tension so thick it was suffocating. James could feel the eyes of diners burning into his skin, waiting for his reaction, watching his downfall unfold in real time. Dr. Carter simply sat there, watching him, waiting. Her expression was unreadable, but there was no mistaking the quiet authority she exuded. Whitmore, the restaurant manager, straightened his jacket, his fingers twitching slightly, as he turned to Dr. Carter. "Madam, I sincerely apologize for the inexcusable treatment you've received tonight. If there is anything we can do—" "Yes," she interrupted, her voice steady, deliberate. "You can start by explaining why a young man like him feels comfortable dismissing someone based solely on appearances." The words landed like a slap. James opened his mouth to protest, to offer some kind of weak defense. But what could he say? That he had assumed she didn't belong? That her elegance hadn't been enough to convince him of her status? That her presence, her quiet dignity, had been overshadowed by his own prejudice? His throat felt dry. He could barely swallow the shame creeping up his spine. Whitmore glanced toward James, expecting him to respond, but James remained frozen in place. The young waiter could feel the disapproving glare of Gregory boring into him from across the room. The older man had known. He had suspected something, tried to warn James without words, but James had been too blinded by arrogance to listen. Dr. Carter let out a small sigh, more disappointed than angry. She took a slow sip from her glass of water, the ice clinking softly against the crystal. "You know," she said, placing the glass down gently, "I've spent my entire life fighting for respect. I've stood in courtrooms where I was underestimated before I even opened my mouth. I've debated men who dismissed me before they even heard my argument. But tonight—" She tilted her head slightly, her piercing gaze locking onto James. "Tonight was almost impressive, because you didn't just dismiss me, You erased me. The blood drained from James's face. I didn't mean, he started, his voice weak, but she raised a hand, stopping him. You did, she said matter-of-factly. And that's the problem. A murmur rippled through the restaurant. Some patrons averted their eyes, uncomfortable with the confrontation, while others watched with barely contained curiosity. Then, the doors burst open. A man entered the room, his sharp suit tailored to perfection, exuding an effortless power that immediately commanded attention. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with the confidence of someone used to being in control. His presence alone sent a ripple through the restaurant as heads turned in recognition. James's stomach plummeted, because he recognized the man too. Adam Carter, a renowned businessman, investor, and philanthropist, a man whose name carried weight in circles James could never dream of entering. And, most importantly, Dr. Evelyn Carter's son. Adam's gaze swept across the restaurant before landing on his mother. The moment he saw her seated alone, the tightness in his jaw became visible. "Mother," he said, his voice a perfect balance of warmth and authority. "Why are you sitting here? Where is your meal?" James barely had time to process the shift in power before everything collapsed. Whitmore immediately stepped forward, his polished demeanor slipping. "Mr. Carter, I can assure you, this is all just a misunderstanding." Adam cut in smoothly, his tone deceptively calm. His eyes flicked to James, assessing him in a heartbeat before looking back at his mother. "Or is it something else?" Dr. Carter smiled, a small, knowing smile that sent a chill down James's spine. She didn't need to say anything. Adam had already understood, and now James was terrified. "I see," Adam said after a pause, turning to Whitmore. "Tell me something. Does this establishment often turn away distinguished guests, or does my mother just not meet your standards?" Whitmore's mouth opened and closed, struggling for words. Of course not, sir. We would never—" "But you did." Adam's voice was sharp now, leaving no room for excuses. "And you allowed it to happen." James felt the weight of Adam's stare land on him, like 1,000 pounds pressing against his chest. "And you?" Adam continued, his tone turning to ice. "Thought you could decide who deserves to be served in this restaurant?" James's breath hitched. Every person in the restaurant was now watching, their forks frozen mid-air, their conversations long forgotten. The tension was unbearable. Dr. Carter sighed, pushing her chair back as she rose gracefully to her feet. The room seemed to shrink around her as she lifted her clutch, smoothing out the fabric of her dress. "It's all right, Adam," she said, ever so softly. "This is nothing new." Her words carried centuries of history. James felt something twist in his gut. Guilt, shame, regret. He couldn't even tell anymore. But Adam wasn't done. "Mother, let's go," he said, offering his arm to her. "We have better places to be." She nodded, looping her arm through his without hesitation. As they turned toward the exit, Adam gave one final glance toward James. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even disappointment. It was indifference. And somehow, that hurt more than anything. As they walked toward the door, Whitmore scrambled after them, his voice nearly desperate. "Mr. Carter, please, allow us to make it right. Dinner on the house, anything you'd like." Dr. Carter paused for only a fraction of a second before looking back, her gaze cool and unreadable. "You already showed me everything I needed to see," she said simply. And then, they were gone. The restaurant, once bustling and vibrant, now felt eerily hollow. And James? James was left standing there, knowing he had just made the worst mistake of his career. James stood frozen in place, his throat dry, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear the hushed murmurs spreading through the restaurant like wildfire. The weight of what had just happened crushed him from all sides. He had turned away one of the most influential women in the country. He had spoken to her like she was beneath him. And now, everyone knew it. The doors had barely swung shut behind Dr. Evelyn Carter and her son when Whitmore turned on him, his face pale with fury. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" His voice was sharp, low enough to keep from making a further scene, but laced with undeniable rage. James swallowed hard, but no words came out. What could he possibly say? Gregory, who had been silent through it all, let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "I've worked here for 20 years, he muttered, mostly to himself. "I've never seen someone dig their own grave so fast." The tension in the restaurant was suffocating. Patrons whispered behind linen napkins, some casting disapproving glances, others shaking their heads in disbelief. James could feel their judgment like a burning weight on his skin. Then, the whispers stopped, because the restaurant doors flew open again. James's breath caught. Adam Carter had returned. The room tensed. Even Whitmore took a step back, his anger quickly replaced with apprehension. Adam Carter was not a man who repeated himself. If he had come back, it was for a reason. Slowly, Adam strode toward the center of the room, his eyes locked onto James like a predator sizing up its prey. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him was a man in a sleek gray suit, holding a leather-bound folder under his arm. An attorney. James felt his stomach drop. Adam stopped in front of Whitmore, his expression unreadable. "I just spoke to my mother," he said, his voice controlled, eerily calm. "She told me not to come back. But you see, I couldn't help myself." Whitmore forced a nervous chuckle. "Mr. Carter, I assure you, this was a misunderstanding. We deeply regret." "Regret?" Adam cut him off, his gaze cold. "You regret that you got caught." James's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He wanted to disappear, to rewind time, to undo every decision that had led to this moment. Adam turned his attention fully to James. "Tell me something," he said. "When my mother walked in, what did you see?" James hesitated, his face burning. I saw." He struggled to find the words, but none of them felt right. Adam leaned in slightly, just enough to make James feel like the ground beneath him was cracking. "You saw someone you thought didn't belong. You made a choice. And now, you'll face the consequences." The attorney beside Adam stepped forward and handed a document to Whitmore. The manager's hands shook as he skimmed through it, his face going from pale to sheet white in mere seconds. James's stomach twisted. "What is that?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Adam smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "The beginning of the end," he said simply. Whitmore let out a shaky breath, rubbing a hand down his face. "They own the hotel," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. His voice was barely above a whisper. "She's one of the major investors." The room went completely silent. James could feel his world collapsing. The woman he had dismissed, the woman he had humiliated, the woman he had refused to serve, owned the very place he worked in. Adam let that sink in before delivering the final blow. "My mother has decided to pull her funding from this establishment." His gaze flickered to Whitmore. "That means you'll be losing a very important investor. And your reputation? Well, let's just say it won't recover from this." James felt his knees go weak. Adam turned away without another word. "Let's go," he told the attorney. As they reached the door, Adam paused just once, glancing back at James with an almost pitying look. Next time, be careful who you look down on, he said. You never know who's sitting at your table. And then, he was gone. James stood there, his career, his reputation, everything, falling apart. The weight of Adam Carter's final words hung in the air long after he left. The restaurant, once a symphony of clinking glasses and quiet chatter, now felt eerily silent. James could barely breathe. Whitmore stood motionless, still clutching the legal document in his trembling hands. His face was devoid of color, his carefully maintained composure shattered beyond repair. He knew what this meant. The reputation of Le Chateau Royal had just taken a fatal hit, and all because of one waiter's arrogance. Slowly, the murmurs began again. Patrons exchanged glances, some whispering behind raised napkins, others openly watching James, waiting for his next move. The shame was unbearable. Gregory, who had been silent through it all, finally let out a deep sigh, shaking his head. I warned you, he muttered under his breath, but you wouldn't listen. James clenched his jaw, his mind spinning. He wanted to defend himself, to argue, but what was left to say? He had judged a woman based on her appearance. He had dismissed her, humiliated her, and now she had effortlessly dismantled everything around him, without even raising her voice. Whitmore finally turned to James, his expression grim. You're fired. The words landed like a hammer. James blinked, his body numb. Sir, please. Enough. Whitmore's voice was sharp, cutting through whatever feeble excuse James was about to muster. You've done enough damage. James looked around, searching for someone, anyone, to defend him. But there was no one. Gregory shook his head again, gathering his tray and walking away without another word. The other waiters avoided eye contact. The guests simply watched, some with disapproval, others with quiet satisfaction. And just like that, James realized the truth. He had spent the entire evening looking down on someone who stood above him all along. And now, the very people he had sought approval from wouldn't even spare him a second glance. With nothing left to say, he removed his apron, placed it on the table, and walked out, vanishing into the night, just as irrelevant as he had once believed Dr. Evelyn Carter to be. The night air was crisp as Dr. Evelyn Carter and her son stepped into their waiting car. Adam held the door open for her, watching as she settled in, her movements as graceful as ever. As the driver pulled away, he finally turned to her with a small smirk. You didn't have to let him off that easy, you know, he mused. Dr. Carter chuckled softly, gazing out the window at the city lights. I didn't need to do anything more, she said simply. Some lessons teach themselves. Adam exhaled, shaking his head. He'll never forget this night. She turned to him, her eyes warm, yet unwavering. Good, she said. Maybe next time he'll think twice before deciding who belongs and who doesn't. Back at Le Chateau Royal, the atmosphere remained tense, but things slowly returned to normal. Almost. Because some mistakes linger, some whispers don't fade, and some names, like Dr. Evelyn Carter, are never forgotten. As the credits of this story roll in your mind, let's talk. Have you ever been underestimated or seen someone judge another too quickly? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your take on this. And if this story made you think, hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful narratives that challenge the way we see the world. Because sometimes the smallest moments teach the biggest lessons. Who knows? Next time, the story might just be yours.